Well, you did go a little crazy though, didn't you? You said, you know, slowly I began to find the extreme concentration coupled with the strange lighting and atmosphere emotionally and physically draining. I loved what we were doing, the raw sounds and textures and layers of instruments, but I felt somehow removed from proceedings while at the same time right inside the sound. It was all-encompassing and dreamlike. I'd never before been so absorbed by a sound or a way of working as with these sessions.
Yeah.
And considering the amount that you had, you know, even up to that point, because this, you know, came at a relatively late stage in your career, the amount that you had worked on, that's quite something. And it was interesting to parallel that with some of the experiences of the session players. You know, Mark Felton, who plays the harmonica on the album, there's an anecdote from him where he remembers it as probably the most physically demanding session I've ever played on. Mark wanted the atmosphere to be right, so he wrote a big X on the floor, and I couldn't move from that area. I had to stand there. He wouldn't allow me to use any reverbs or things like that. Everything had to be natural, no artificial sounds at all. I think I was there practically all afternoon, or certainly the best part of a day, experimenting with different sounds. I was stuck in position like a birdman, bent over. I came out of that session, I remember ringing home and saying, Christ alive, I've been in the session today and I can hardly move. That's a harmonica session as well, that is great.
No, I think you have a mixture with musicians, those people that absolutely loved what was happening and totally got it. Simon Edwards, the bass player, was one of those. And other musicians like, you know, Danny Thompson, who the next session he went to the next day actually told the guy, I think I've just done the worst session of my life. You know, you either got it or you didn't. But I think they were harsh in a way on musicians. I mean, just being led into a room that's in darkness, no one communicated. We never talked to them. So, you know, it wasn't putting the button down and going, hi, right, we'll send you the track. You know, there was no communication, and the track would just start, and they would do whatever they were going to do. And we always did 8 takes of each musician, and so we were on tape, so you have to wait for it all to spool back. But no one would talk during that time. It wasn't like, great, here's another take, you know. And some people just got really, it's quite, you know, tough to go through that, because I guess you think, am I not getting this right? You know, am I messing up all the time, or what's going on? You know, and it's pitch black. So some people really had a hard time.
And you made a block of recordings of these session musicians, and then essentially, you know, sort of selectively, very selectively at points, took what you needed, right?
Yeah. The thing, again, this is a bit technical, so I don't want to bore you, but we had 2 24-track machines that were synced together. So we had 46 tracks of analog, and we had 32 tracks of a Mitsubishi digital, but we also had 5 other 24-track reels of tape, which we called slaves. So we could actually record 100 and something tracks of analog, which was completely unheard of really then. Most albums were done in the 80s, 46 track. So we synced all these together, and every musician that came in got 8 takes on the Mitsubishi. So our, you know, 25 to 32 were the 8 takes that we just used for those takes. So sometimes, you know, we did have Spirit of Eden inside one all in one 23-minute run, so we could do it as a run if we wanted to. But let's say we do a 5-minute song, 8 takes, so they'd, you know, be there a couple of hours, they'd leave, and it might then take a day, sometimes 2 days, to listen through to everything, decide what was wanted, and then also where on the album it was going to be, because we offset all these machines. So it's like modern cut and paste with digital. But we were doing it in real time, in the dark, with no screen or anything, so it was all mathematics. And that's why it took so long. I mean, it was painstaking.
And these musicians were in the dark, you know, figuratively as well as literally.
Yeah.
That's my line.
You've, Ben, you detail how one of them, or maybe it was even you, Phill, said Mark wouldn't say anything to anyone. There were no niceties exchanged after the session, no feedback in any way.
I think we probably both said that. I mean, that was the, yeah. I mean, it was keeping them in the dark. It was almost like, I think you said this to me, Phill, when we did one of our interviews, that it was, you never could quite tell whether Mark was doing it for a wind-up, you know, having musicians in the dark, not telling them what they were playing, not telling them anything, giving them any guidance, not giving them any feedback. And I think Tim Freeze-Green also said, you know, they got to a point where they sort of start not perhaps taking bets, but just saying, I wonder how long this guy's going to last before he gets raised.
Well, there was that, but that's what I meant by the humour. As everything went on, that's why Laughing Stock was so tough. But as it went on, the humour got more and more vicious in a way. So what that can start out as being quite amusing, and that, like you say, a bit of a gamble. Do you think he's going to make it? Here's a fiver, he doesn't. You know, that weeks later, months later, it has turned into something much more vicious.
But the other thing is he's actually making the right choices. I mean, again, you told me, you know, he'd make slightly sort of irksome demands, but you'd always end up doing it, and it would be the right choice, it would be the right decision.
Always right. And
like the choir, I mean, the whole choir on I Believe in You, wiped. Tell me, I mean.
Well, we had an adult choir come in and sing the Hallelujah on I Believe in You, and we had, you know, the tea lady Betty, who used to make our tea every so often. She was in tears. It was quite beautiful, this choir, 25-piece, I think. And the next day, when Mark walked in the morning, we put up, you know, the stuff from the day before, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like the Cliff Adams Singers. Just erase it." And I know a lot of you won't be old enough to know the Cliff Adams Singers, but they were kind of around in the kind of 60s. They did kind of easy listening in stereo kind of records, and they were great singers, but it was very kitsch, you know. So Mark said, no, it's the Cliff Adams Singers, erase it. And I actually copied it onto one of our slave reels because I had such a problem of putting it into record and getting rid of it, and thinking also that Mark might change his mind, which he very rarely did, in fact. So it kind of existed for a while. But back to your thing about, you know, this thing keeping him in the dark, the other side of the coin was that Mark they didn't want to influence the musicians in any way either. It was very much what you feel and what you hear at this moment in time, do it. So they never kind of led them by saying, oh, that's really cool, man, let's do one more with a bit more. None of that happened, which would normally happen on all the sessions I'd ever done beforehand. But they didn't want to influence anyone. So I think that's why the original thing of not talking, but again, that turned much more sinister, I think.
Slightly ironic, given the name of the band.
But that Cliff Adams Singers recording, you sent me an MP3 of that, and I have to say, you know, even though you're absolutely right, it's good, but it's not as good as ultimately the Chelmsford Boys Choir. Yeah, the boys' choir that ended up, which is so haunting.
Mark was right.
We'll hear it obviously a bit later.
Mark was right.
Mark was right, you know, and brutal though that was to erase all those people.
I mean, you had a write-up recently for the book, I don't know if it was in Mojo or something, and in large letters, quote by me was, Mark was such an arsehole, but he was right more than he was wrong. And I was thinking, great, thank you very much for all the things I've said about talking about, and that's what they bring out. But it is kind of true, you know, he was very difficult to deal with sometimes, but he was right more than he was wrong. He saw things, he looked at everything from a different angle, and not just music, but, you know, my time with him, he'd always be looking at a slightly weirder angle than all of us. You know, we're all looking at that. He's seeing it from somewhere else. And I mean, the big success for me with Spirit Bean is that it feels like five guys in a room playing an album. It's all an illusion, you know, note by note, it's been placed. Nothing is a performance. Even Mark Felton's harp solo is edited, and there's a little bit where we put it backwards. You know, there's a lot of trickery and stuff going on, but it feels real. And I think that's success, because you put a bunch of people in a studio for a year with 350 grand, it could have just been rubbish, you know.
I mean, there's a wonderful sort of, you know, little quote from Mark, sort of on this subject, that, you know, sort of quasi-redemptive, you know, in everything that we've been talking about, and it's very much in line with what you're saying there, Phill. Ben, you quote Mark as saying, all this, this is an interview with Melody Maker, all this album is really saying is, let's bring music back to the basics. And in that sense, I think its ethic is back with the punk movement, which is where things started for me. Punk said, technicality is unimportant. All that's important is that you want to make records, or that you want to get up on stage and play, and everyone in this world, if they want to be, is a musician.
Yeah.
Including you.
Including me. It was on I Believe in You, and we'd exhausted, because I mean, after a while, there's only so many instruments and musicians and people that you can kind of bring in and try. And we, on the instrumental section of I Believe in You, is basically kind of 20 people playing different instruments and then just using like one note from this and two notes from that. So you get this kind of solo made out of all these different bits. And it was pretty much near the end of overdubs anyway. And Mark said it needs something else. It needs one more element. You know, he could hear this or think this. Everyone else was just kind of, you know, relieved that we'd managed to even get a solo. And he said, it needs one more thing. And I said, what about bowed guitar, which I loved from way back at Olympics, seeing a band do bowed guitar. And he went, brilliant idea, right, take my country gent, there's a bow, go and do it.
It's a Gretsch country gentleman guitar.
And I said, I can't play, you know, I'm not a musician. And he said, look, you've sat and watched musicians all your life. He said, just move your hands about, it's all chance. And there I was in the studio with headphones on, playing bow guitar, which I had no idea what I was really doing, but just going with the feel, you know, and it survived, you know. And again, Mark's humour, when I walked back in after my, you know, number of takes, because it was always the same kind of thing, edited down, and he said, oh, you bastards, you've got the best lick on the album. And that was obviously him being its hyper kind of, you know, his humour to another level. But in a way, he's right, it is that punk thing. It's like, you don't actually know what you're doing, but if you believe in something and just get up there and do it, something will happen. Yeah. And I mean, that's how these albums were made, really, but we had the time and all the tracks, and because it wasn't the technology of today, to, you know, to do it that way. But it was, a lot of it was chance, you know, it was just...
It was almost like he was sampling, though. I mean, the album is kind of proto-sampling, it's creating his own samples from live musicians, but it's sampling nonetheless.
It is.
And I think it's fascinating what you said, how it predates, probably only by a couple of years, before all studios got digital audio workstations and, you know, screens, basically. And people worked off Logic and Pro Tools. And you firmly believe that if you had been doing it on Pro Tools and doing the same kind of tapestry of different fragments, it would have been different because you would have been working visually, looking at the screen.
It would have been fantastically easier. It wouldn't have sounded the same, and I don't think you'd have ended up with the same results. Because we were in the dark and we had no screens, you can only go by what you hear. So when you start offsetting tape machines, after you've done the maths to move it from verse 1 to, you know, chorus 3 or whatever you're doing, and then you start fine-tuning it. So first of all, you might dial in like 2 minutes 40 seconds to get it roughly in the ballpark. Then you start knocking it down into seconds, then milliseconds, until, you know, Mark usually again would go, that's right. It all seemed to be improvisation and then editing and structuring being done in real time as we were. It turns out it took 25 years or something for me to find out, but it seems that there was a rough demo of some of the Spirit of Eden tracks that Mark and Tim had put together at Tim's house. So they knew kind of what they were after, I guess. But those demos were never talked about, never played. I mean, it was very much we always used to start really with Martin Ditcham on a shaker, so that we had something to, you know, we had to get something down first. So a lot of it, Martin Ditcham would be in a, we put him in a mic cupboard because we didn't want him to leak, and Lee would play drums to Martin. So Martin was a human click track because we didn't like click tracks. So we got Martin Ditcham to do a shaker, and Lee would play to that as his human click track. Then we'd get rid of Martin and then overdub for real. So as far as I knew, there were no demos. No lyrics, no. They didn't come until, you know, the tracks were down 6 months in, which was the same for all the 3 records I did with him. I never saw or had any lyrics.
All of the, well, I mean, you were, I remember when we spoke about this, you were telling me all of the songs, obviously all of the songs had different names, didn't they,
yeah.
when you were making them, so, and you still know.
Well, I know that we had...
Like Eden was called Maureen.
Yeah, we had Eric, Maureen. Oh, I forgot it in my bag. Oh, it's here.
And Maureen was the one that Tim Freeze-Green leaked just after Mark had died, and it struck me that it was called Maureen. You thought it was perhaps called Maureen Lipman.
Yeah, Mark often said, well, Maureen Lipman, I mean, there's an actress. But, you know, whether he's being serious or not. But I don't...
He said that about Russ Abbott as well,
yeah.
to be fair, to the NME.
I don't actually have...
But Maureen, if you go back to, I think it is Eden, isn't it, Maureen? The track Eden,
yeah.
which we'll hear. But if you, when we
Norm.
listen to...
Norm was another.
Okay.
Eric, Maureen, Norm.
And Norm, yeah. But there's a bit in it with a kind of a bass drum, insistent bass drum coming in, and then the guitar, choppy guitar coming in, which sounds really like the Velvet's Heroin. So I'm convinced that they called it after Mo Tucker, that one.
Quite possibly. But I said
my
that's
personal
when you're
theory.
when you're working with especially Mark, but I mean Tim, I say he picked up on that. But when you're working with people, and I mean it was talked about earlier on, when you like his interviews, but if he's half the time being honest and saying sensible things, and then half the time winding you up or just making it crack, it's very hard. You can't really decipher, and I was around him a lot. You can't always decipher whether he's serious or not. And I know we're not on Laughing Stock tonight, but this will give you an example of the working titles for Laughing Stock were Merman, Dogner. Now Dogner became Ascension Day, Surge became After the Flood, and then we had Mauler, and Mauler is New Grass. So the problem I have is that when people talk about, and I should have got it by now, it's 30 years, but when people talk about certain tracks on Spirit of Eden, when they go, oh yeah, I love whatever, it doesn't actually mean anything to me because I don't know what track they're talking about because I spent all that time with these working titles. And I mean, this is a photocopy of a master at Abbey Road. So even at that stage, it's still written down as working titles. We never had a title for Mark's solo album. At one point, it was going to be called Mountain of the Moon, if it was a Talk Talk album. But then it was decided, obviously, as no one in Talk Talk was involved, it should be Mark Hollis' album. And then it just came out as Mark Hollis, but that had a title. As far as I know, Spirit of Eden didn't have a title. I Believe in You was originally called Snow in Berlin. So yeah. No.
One day someone's going to catch you off guard and say, are you the guy that worked on Maureen?
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Let's take another question. Yes, gentleman over there.
Hiya. John Cope was recorded during the Spirit of Eden sessions, and that was released as a B-side, and I Believe in You. Was it ever a consideration for the album?
John Cope, was that a consideration?
Yeah, it wasn't really. It was just, in fact, there was something recorded that they brought in. So there was something, I think it might have been the drums that were already down for that. So it was probably a hangover from Colour of Spring, in fact, but unfinished. And then we dumped that onto tape and created the John Cope. But it was, from my memory, it was never considered as part of the album. It was always this additional track that we worked on. It was a great track, actually. A lot of us really liked it, but Spirit of Eden by then had really taken on. I mean, side one we had that in order very early on with the intro section, the links. You know, that was
The intro section is called model, isn't it, or model?
modal, yeah.
Modal.